And we now need not to make a moral equivalence. Not all religions are the same. Not true. Right? The major voices in every system are not the same. They differ from each other. And Hamas, it's not that Hamas equals Islam. Here's the next point. I am not saying Hamas equals Islam. Not saying that. I am saying Hamas is tragically emergent from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is from the late 20s in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood, right, is emergent not from tangential positions in Islam, but from mainstream positions in Islam that were never repudiated. That is correct. So we need the Muslim Brotherhood to be repudiated, right? We need Hamas to be repudiated. We need to take that seriously. We can't tell Islam who should be at its center, but we need voices like the Sufis, like the Rumis, right, to begin to become central in Islam. I am, where am I now? Where am I? You see the background there? You like that? I am in the basement of Zion's house and his mom in Portland. Zion is my son who just was bar mitzvahed. There's a big party going on right now that I'm supposed to be at the center of, and everyone's pretty much mad at me for being downstairs in the basement. So welcome, but it's a time where the only thing that I can say to my son is that this is a time, and my son looked me in the eye and he said, Daddy, of course. And I told him I'd be up in a little bit. But of course, we have to talk about Israel today, and we can't wait. Because this is our responsibility in this moment, and we have to talk about Gaza now. We have to talk about human beings. We have to talk about what does it mean to be Homo Amor with our hearts ripped apart. And this podcast is my birthday present, my bar mitzvah present to my son, right, to Zion. And his name is Zion, which tells you something. So, oh my God, right? Oh my God. So I'm going to be disorganized today. We have to be disorganized. I'm going to hold enormous confusion today because we need to be confused. And I want to be completely clear today because we need to be clear, right? We need to have clarity. And there is clarity in the confusion. So we need some radical certainties here. There are radical certainties at play. And we need to hold uncertainty. Does everyone get that? We need to lead from our certainties, and we need to lead from our uncertainties. Some 30 years ago, I wrote a book, a 2-volume set, which Talia and I are just going to work on now and put out in English. And the volume set the first volume is called Certainty, and the second volume is called Uncertainty. And we used to think that trust or faith or religion, which is religare, to connect the dots, meant complete certainty. And religion at its best, not in its tragic forms. Hamas is the most degraded form of religion, a violation of the term religion. But religion in its sacred forms actually takes us into a world where there are certain core certainties. But they're not dogmatic certainties that it is true out there. There's certainties that I am true. There's certainties that the world is not just matter. It's not merely a materialist field, but the world is what matters. The world is it's a moral universe. And actually, one of the core understandings we have in cosmorotic humanism is that matter and what matters are not split. In other words, what matters, the moral universe, the world of ethos, doesn't begin at the level of the human being. The world of ethos lives already in the world of matter. Okay? So as we enter today, we have to enter from that place of radical certainty, but we also have to hold radical uncertainty. Radical uncertainty, we don't know. We have to live in what the Christian mystics called the cloud of unknowing. And one of the tragedies of Islam, and I'm going to say that clearly, and this is one of the places that I am aligned with my friend not in terms of we know each other, but my colleague who I disagree with about virtually everything, right, in terms of substantive worldview. But one of the places that we agree, Sam Harris. Sam courageously, a decade ago, took on the confusion of some of culture, which basically said something like all religions are the same. That's not true. All religions are not the same. Only someone who's never practiced in a tradition would say that. All religions are not the same. They're fundamentally different. And Judaism and Christianity each have dimensions of them which need to be repudiated, right? There are voices that need to be taken on and repudiated. So, for example, in the Hebrew wisdom tradition, there are voices that talk about entering Canaan and killing everyone in Canaan, which is what happened in the ancient world. Now, whatever that story was, immediately the readers of those texts, called the Talmud, first century, time of Jesus, before, hundreds of years before Jesus, they said, no, those texts need to be repudiated. Those texts were meant as archetypal understandings. They need to be repudiated, and it needs to be very clear that we can never identify a person based on the place that they were born. That every human being is Homo Imago Dei. That every human being bleeds the blood of the sacred. And that there's no one outside of the circle. That's cosmoerotic humanism. Every human being is the cosmoerotic universe in person. And so Judaism repudiated those texts correctly over a couple of thousand years. The Catholic Pope today has taken on some of the travesties of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church functioned for several hundred years for 1,000 years as a mixture of, and I'm going to say a hard sentence here, a mixture of deep, profound goodness and a criminal organization, which was fundamentally corrupt, which extorted and killed and pillaged in the name of Christ. And Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young got it right when they sung, how many people died in the name of Christ, I can't believe it all. Right? And Sinead O'Connor, when she ripped up the face of a pope I think it was at Madison Square Garden, was protesting that, Sinead O'Connor. She said, this is not Christ. And this pope, like Pope John in the late 50s, have stood and said, no, that vision of Christ is wrong. And we've made mistakes. And Christianity has, over the last several hundred years since the Renaissance, worked hard at transforming itself. And it's an incomplete transformation, like transformations always are. But both Judaism and Christianity, which themselves can't be compared. There's not a Judeo-Christian ethic. It's not true. They're very, very different visions. But both of them have gone through a fundamental process of evolution, an evolution of love, an evolution of consciousness. Tragically, and this is Sam Harris's point, Islam has not gone through that evolution. It has not met the experience of what my friend John Wellwood called growing up. So John, my friend John, who I met a couple of times, he was actually dear friends with Zion's mom, Mariana Kaplan. And so I met him originally. John wrote a book called Psychology of Awakening. And on page 7, he says we need to distinguish an awakening between waking up and growing up. Waking up means you have a direct and clear experience, right, of the God voice, right? A genuine experience of this intrinsic nature of divinity that lives in the world, that lives and holds us and perhaps even, right, lives in us completely. And that's absolutely true. And John said, wake up. And every great tradition has a genuine experience. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Confucianism, each use different language. They don't agree with each other about an enormous amount. But there is a sense, as Huxley already pointed out in his book, The Perennial Philosophy, there's a shared sense of waking up, of a meeting with a ground of meaning that's real. However, John pointed to something that the Hebrew wisdom tradition that Solomon understood very well. You can't just wake up, you have to grow up. Meaning your experience of the divine is mediated through two things. One, and this is what John emphasized, your psychological maturity, who you are as a person, your goodness or your badness, the clarification of your desire. Are you, in fact, a clear prism for that experience of waking up? So the movie Lord of the Rings by Tolkien talks about how Sauron, who's the kind of corrupt force of degraded power, seduces Saruman, who is Gandalf. Gandalf's the wizard. Remember Gandalf? Gandalf's teacher is Saruman. And Saruman is seduced because of his own internal brutality, his own sense of brokenness, gets seduced by Sauron, and Saruman is the one who creates armies of orcs, right, who are fundamentally expressions of the movement and the ontology of evil in the world. It's a big deal. So we can get seduced. So John Wellwood points out in his beautiful book, Psychology of Awakening, he says, okay, you've got to grow up. You've got to actually go through it, not just as a person, but as a collective people. You have to go through a process of psychological maturity. Now, just like not all religions are the same, not all peoples are the same. No racism. Everyone is created in the image of she. Everyone. No one's excluded from the circle. And societies are not the same in their development. That's just true. That was Sam Harris's point, which the liberal community tried to take his head off for. But he was actually right. There are actually different levels of development. That's actually true. That's what we call the evolution of consciousness. The evolution of consciousness means that the Christianity that went to kill Moors in the Middle Ages, waging the Crusades, were actually, right, in violation of what we would today call love. And they thought they were standing for love. They were in violation of love. And consciousness needs to evolve. And there needs to be an evolution of consciousness. And we need to understand that actually there's a progression, right? Evolution is the evolution of love. Evolution is the progressive deepening of intimacies. Evolution is when we realize, stage by stage, we used to think in the medieval period, there's someone outside the circle. I'm in the circle, other people are outside. That's what the Christians thought. That's what the Muslims thought. The Jews had texts that suggested that they were not in power, so they didn't enact those texts. And we'll talk about that in a second. Right? But in other words, there was a notion that we're on the inside, they're on the outside. There's no one outside the circle. That's the evolution of love. That's the evolution of consciousness. And that's something that is central. Every human being is Homo Imago Dei in potential and in actuality. Tragically, however, I can violate my Homo Imago Dei. Hitler was born Homo Imago Dei, was born in the image of God. Hitler's mother was born in the image of God. And yet something happened. And Goebbels and Hitler and Himmler and the Waffen SS created gas chambers that gassed 12,000 people a day. Right? And so something happened. The image of God got violated. And that does tragically take place. The human being can be the most stunning and beautiful and unimaginably gorgeous expression of the field of Eros, or the human being can become demonized. Now, stay close. Every individual and any individual human being can become demonized. From any group. That's a potential from any group. And there's also a fundamental distinction. And the fundamental distinction, these are fundamental moral distinctions, is what is the basic teaching of the story that you're presenting in the world? And this was Harris's point. If the story you're presenting in the world is one in which there are basically two groups of people, Dar el-Harb and Dar el-Islam, those who should be destroyed by the sword, and those who are of Islam. You've had this experience of waking up, but you haven't grown up. You haven't achieved psychological maturity, and your level of consciousness hasn't evolved. So you've remained both psychologically distorted, one, two, right, two, and let's get this really clear, two, and we got to go step by step here. Two, your actual consciousness hasn't evolved. You're still ethnocentric. Not only are you ethnocentric, you think anyone outside of your ethnocentric circle isn't actually a human being, and therefore shouldn't be treated as a human being, and therefore should be eviscerated, raped, pillaged, burned, decapitated for the sake of your God. Right? So that's tragic. That's tragic. And that thinking is tragically written into the very covenant of Hamas. You just have to read the founding document of Hamas. And the founding document of Hamas makes it very clear. There is no room for a two-state solution. There is no room for two peoples who have competing claims in a land, right, to create negotiation, to recognize each other's humanity, right, to share when there's a conflict, right, to work out possible solutions that actually honor the dignity and humanity of all. No, the covenant says, until the blood of the Jews spreads over, right, all of the land, and we find the Jew hiding behind the rock and slaughter them, and the Jew hiding behind the tree and slaughter them, until that happens, Allah is not honored. Okay, friends, we got to begin by making moral distinctions. If you can't make moral distinctions, you can't have a conversation. Okay, but before I get there, I'm going to get to moral equivalence. I'm going to take this step by step, and I apologize. I'm not going to be organized. This is not an organized moment. I'm going to try and hit point by point. Okay, but I'm not sitting here with a little outline. I'm surrounded by pieces of paper and dozens of articles, and I spent all Thursday night on this and all Friday, and I was about to podcast with my friend Aubrey Marcus, but we weren't ready, so we're going to podcast tomorrow on this topic. And I wasn't planning to be here today because I thought I would do the podcast with Aubrey and everyone would hear and I'd be able to respond. But when we didn't podcast on Friday, I said to Aubrey, I've got to show up, and be with my family, and you're my family, and we're each other's family, no matter what. So I need to be here at the bar mitzvah, and we need to be together, and we need to talk this through. And we need to place our attention on it. We need to place our attention on it. To love is to place your attention. And to place attention, you have to be able to hold a storyline. And to hold a storyline, you can't read short articles. You can't read 5-minute clips. You've got to know the story. You've got to check the history, but check it carefully, not in a 15-minute clip that you read someplace. Read serious papers, serious books on both sides. Find credible information. Compare the information. Find credible sources. You can find them. They're out there. But you've got to read. You can't troll around on social media and read legacy media. You've got to actually go to the sources, place your attention. To be Homo Amor is to do sense making. To do sense making is to be able to follow a storyline. Yes, there are multiple perspectives in a story. Yes, of course there are. But there is not a perspectival madness. There's a shared ground of fact. And that shared ground of fact is a shared ground of value that needs to enable us to create a shared grammar of value. There's a reason that John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Republican and Democrat, radically opposed to each other, were good friends because they shared a story of value. They shared a grammar of value. We need a universal grammar of value in the world that we can all share, whatever our position is on a story. We can disagree. A couple can disagree. In a couple, we can have different visions of how we got to this conflict. But if you can't have between that couple a shared, larger story of value, then they polarize. And when they polarize, they're so shamed by their polarization that they split apart. And when they split apart, they try and destroy each other. That's how so much of Western divorce works, right? Right, so we need to actually stay in relationship. We're in a globe in which no one can be out of relationship. There is no local. There's only one people and one breath, right? And one love, right? And one heart. And no one can be out of the story. And we can have different perspectives and we can have different instruments in the Unique Self Symphony. But there has to be a shared music. There has to be a capacity to articulate a shared story of value, even within our conflicts. And that is absolutely possible if we have integrity. If we're honest, if we're authentic, that can be done. But that's not what's happening today. And so one of the things we need to say to begin with is those people who are adherents of Islam, that are holding the beautiful versions of Islam, which are there, they need to be madly supported. We need to pour everything we can into them becoming, right, the voices, but they need to have the courage, which is not easy, to actually repudiate the major narratives of Islam. Nicholas Kristof, who's a left-wing writer, writes in the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof writes about, he says, he doesn't want to say it, but he says actually central to the narrative of Islam. I'm going to read to you a second. Let me just actually find this for a second. And I'm here on my phone. I made a list, right, of different things I wanted to share with you, but let me just read you. This is Nicholas Kristof writing in the Times. He says, in my reporting in Gaza over the years, I've come to believe that one source is the incitement of Hamas and some other Palestinian groups, creating a culture that glorifies martyrs who die while killing Israelis. It's sadly common to talk to children in Gaza whose dream isn't to become firefighters or doctors, but suicide bombers. But here's the thing, and this is the point that Harris made. And I made it independently, but I want to cite Sam because this is not a fringe position that I got lost in 10 years ago. This narrative in Islam is not a fringe narrative that's hijacking, right, a fundamentally document which is the vision of Isaiah or Ezekiel or Christ's Sermon on the Mount that's now being hijacked. No, you don't have Christ's Sermon on the Mount at the very center of Islam. You don't have Isaiah, right, at the center of Islam. Right? There are voices, but those voices are actually side voices. They're tangential voices. Right? Central to the narrative of Islam, right, is, right, an glorification of the martyr who slaughters the infidel, not as an original text that's been repudiated, but as the current operative political text. And anyone read the Quran cover to cover, read the Torah cover to cover, read the Bible, the New Testament cover to cover, and read the Quran cover to cover. If you're not doing that, please, you're not placing your attention. You're reading little clips. And I've read the Quran cover to cover, and the New Testament cover to cover, and the Bible cover to cover, the Torah, the original Torah. They're not the same document. And then read the mainstream commentaries in each document. Right? There's not a moral equivalence. Islam needs to evolve. Islam needs to itself participate in the evolution of love. We need, right? That's what Rumi did. Rumi was part of the evolution of Islam. And Rumi wasn't by himself. Rumi was part of really thousands of gorgeous men and women who participated in the evolution of Islam. So Islam can evolve from within its own documents. It has the raw material. But the center of Islam's got to become Rumi, right? And Hafiz, and the thousands of other men and women who were people of stunning hearts, who said it doesn't matter whether I'm a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. Right? We're all God's friend. Right? That needs to become the voice of Islam. And on my knees, I beg, right, those people who live in Islam, right, and anything we can do, right, to support, right, the voices of clarity in Islam, it has to be done. And we now need not to make a moral equivalence. Not all religions are the same. Not true. Right? The major voices in every system are not the same. They differ from each other. And Hamas, it's not that Hamas equals Islam. Here's the next point. I am not saying Hamas equals Islam. Not saying that. I am saying Hamas is tragically emergent from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is from the late 20s in Egypt, And the Muslim Brotherhood, right, is emergent not from tangential positions in Islam, but from mainstream positions in Islam that were never repudiated. That is correct. So we need the Muslim Brotherhood to be repudiated, right? We need Hamas to be repudiated. We need to take that seriously. We need Rumi and Hafiz. We need the Sufis, right? Or we can't tell Islam who should be at its center, but we need voices like the Sufis, like the Rumis, right, to begin to become central in Islam. Okay. Wow. That's point one. That's point one. Cha. Point two, right? And it's hard not to break out into tears, my friends. But we have to be Homo Amor. What does it mean to be a mad lover at this time? We have to be Homo Amor. We have to be clear. And we have to think about the whole. And we need to be in a relationship to the whole. And no one's outside the circle. And actions need to be taken. And we need clarity. We need to hold uncertainty, right? And clarity at the same time. And lead from both. So let me try and come to point two here. And I'm just going to be looking at different pieces of paper that I wrote down to try and find my way with you, okay? So next point. Okay, are we together? Are we okay? Okay, here we go. Anyone who tells you, right, I know exactly what Israel should do right now, do not believe, right? Really? You know exactly what Israel should do right now? Are you for real? My son, right, is in the army right now. I don't know whether he's on his way to Gaza. I don't know whether he's in Gaza or whether he's another part of the country. My daughter rejoined her unit. My other son may or may not, unclear. But it's not about my son. It's about, right, Israel has a citizens' army. Israel doesn't have a standing army. When America went to Iraq, there wasn't, I think, maybe there was one member of Congress who had a child in the armed services. So notice there was this kind of standing army doing the work in Iraq. That's not Israel. Israel has a small standing army. Israel mobilizes the shopkeepers and the dentists and the lawyers and the gardeners and the kindergarten teachers. That's who goes to fight, right? Right? We're talking about the people who are in our hearts in Israel. Right, so Israel's not a jingoist war machine, which has some standing army that goes to fight its degraded wars. That's not what's happening here. Let's just understand where we are. And let me go deeper with you. Let's see if I can get deeper with you. There is not clarity about what Israel should do now. There's not. But here's what we know. Let me see if I'm going to take this slowly, step at a time. I'm going to take this slowly, step at a time. The first, and there's so many thoughts crowding my head, and each one is related to every other thought, so I'm going to try and get it out in order. Okay? So point two. Point two. There's been this call from some colleagues of mine to have an international body intervene. Israel should step back. There'll be an international body, which should be a police body, that should step in and handle Gaza. So, number one, I think that in the ideal and correct world, I think that's actually correct. I think that terrorism in the world of the kind that we saw in the last 10 days should not be policed by one nation state. When I was with the Dalai Lama in his back room, right, in Dharamsala, and he said to me, people say I'm a pacifist, haha, we need an army in the world. And we talked about the possibility of there being a one army. And so in the ideal world, that would be Sharmila, my friend Sharmila. That would be the right thing to do. That is utterly not real right now, however. And the people who are calling for it, again, with mad love, friends, they know it's not real. There is absolutely zero possibility of that happening in any kind of short term. Right? We don't have a group that's trained, that has international support, or that has the capacity to respond. So to suggest that the response should be an international body that does not exist is to essentially say that nothing should happen, right? That there should be no response, right, of genuine measure, right, to the horror. So I want to make that clear. People can take disingenuous public positions. Let's have an international police body do this. There is no international police body. You know there's not an international police body. You know that we haven't replaced the nation state yet. Should we move beyond the nation state? Possibly. That's a big conversation. Is the nation state critical to the functioning of the world? Possibly. That's a very big conversation that you got to place your attention and your heart on to begin to understand, right? What's the value of a world government? What's the shadow of a world government? Right? What's the value of a nation state? What's the shadow of a nation state? Those are very big and real questions, my friends. We're not being glib here. That's a big conversation. We should do a one mountain just on that question. But there's zero question that in this moment in time, there is no real possibility of this being handled by some other group. So for someone to kind of posture in order to fulfill whatever they're trying to fulfill, to call, let's say in a video, Hamas pure evil, as one author did, which is actually correct. That was Marion Williamson. Hamas is pure evil. That Marion was correct. But then to say that only an international force can deal with it, and brute force is not the solution, and to then make a moral equivalence, right, between the two perspectives here, is beyond problematic. Okay, so those positions are not real. They're just not real. So that just needs to be said, because there's this kind of position floating around, right, about some international force that's supposed to intervene. That is not a real option. The people who are suggesting it know it's not real right now. Having said that, that is where we should be going. We should be going to a place where we have a shared language of value. And as long as we need an army, it would be a correct division to have one army. But if you have one army, then you have to deal with the shadows of that one army. And how's that one army controlled, and who runs that one army? So these are very real issues which cannot be thrown around glibly in short social media posts that pander to particular populations and try and allow a person to kind of hold all of their constituencies. That is not moral courage. Moral courage is actually to recognize right now in this moment, right, the UN counterterrorism force has no capacity to do this whatsoever. That's clear as day. There's no one who thinks that they do. Okay, so let's go in further. Let's go deeper. Let's go deeper, step at a time, deeper. Point 3, let's just talk about moral equivalence for a second. So I just want to give you two scenarios. And we're going to talk about the larger story here, right? But we're not there yet. I want to just go step at a time. Moral equivalence. Now, you know what? Before moral equivalence, I want to go someplace else. Before moral equivalence, right? Let me go someplace else. Let's talk about a group of people that the divine voice, whatever that voice means, the literary divine voice, and Becca, this is for you, love, that the literary divine voice in the original text of Genesis says, these people are wicked. Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? You with me, friends? God says, I am going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because these people have violated every dimension of what it means to be a human being. We're going to destroy them. That's the God voice. Stay close, everyone. That's the God voice. And Abraham says, fuck you, God. And I stand with Abraham. Fuck you, God. No way. And God says, hello, Mr. Abraham. Hello. I'm God, you're Abraham. Shut up. And Abraham says, I'm not shutting up. No. God says, well, what do you mean? Make an argument. And Abraham says, maybe there are 50 righteous people? Right? Maybe there are 50 righteous people. Are there 50 righteous people in Gaza? Of course there are. Is Gaza as a whole merely held hostage by a kind of rabid, horrific Hamas? Not exactly. That's not exactly the situation at all, tragically. We'll get there. But that's not the point. Are there innocent, beautiful, and good people in Gaza? Of course there are. Of course there are. Right? And so Abraham says to God, how can you destroy Sodom and Amorah? There might be 50 righteous people, and God says, go find them for me. And Abraham can't find them. So Abraham says, well, there's 40. Well, go find them for him. Well, there's 30, says Abraham. Can't find them. Abraham says, there's 20. You can't destroy if there's 20. God says there's no 20. Abraham says there's 10. Abraham can't find the 10. But Abraham doesn't give up. He says, fuck that. Right? And there's a lot of cursing in the Bible. I apologize. No more cursing today. Okay, I apologize, Oriana. I got caught up in the heat of the moment. So Abraham turns to God and says, okay, you won the argument that you're God, but I don't care. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Will the judge of the whole world not do justice? Right? Will the judge of the whole world not do, and I want you to track this word, I'm going to ask people to put it in the chat box. Will the judge of the whole world not do mishpat, justice? And then 3 verses later, there's what's called the election of Abraham, where Abraham is elected, as it were, to become a moral force in the world. And the God voice, the literary God voice in the Genesis text explains why Abraham is invoked, enrolled for this mission of becoming a moral force in the world. Why is he chosen, as it were? And so the text reads, and I want you to get just the last word. The text reads, Ki yadati v'leman asher yitzavet banav et beito acharav lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. Because the divine voice says, because I know that Abraham is going to transmit to future generations the doing of justice, mishpat. But one second, what does Abraham have to do with mishpat, justice? There's only one place where Abraham's identified with this notion of mishpat, justice. When he challenges God 3 verses earlier, and he says, will the judge of the whole world not do justice? Did you get that, everyone? So Abram becomes Abraham because he is going to teach the future generations to demand justice. And I am proud of the voices that have been central voices for decades in the Hebrew wisdom community that have stood and created, 1,000 programs of Palestinian-Jewish coexistence, that have stood and that today stand against an Israeli invasion of Gaza. I'm proud of them. I don't know whether they're right or wrong. They don't know whether they're right or wrong. Right? Israel's faced with an impossibility. Right? But I'm proud of voices that speak in the tradition of Abraham and say, what if there are 50 righteous people in the middle of the city? Now, it's a different moment. And there's many reasons why those voices might be wrong, and there's counter voices that are equally powerful. But those voices, when they're clarified, when they come from our deepest heart's desire, when they're purified, those voices are holy, even if they're wrong. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. This is a place where we need to hold radical certainty and radical uncertainty, right? But first, I want to make place for those voices. Those voices aren't evil. Those voices are sacred. And I'm proud of a Hebrew wisdom community that can hold those multiple voices, right? And I'm proud of an Israel that's a pluralistic democracy that has very, very, very different fierce contestations in Israel over what the right policy is, because that's what a democracy is. There are no contestations of that kind in any one of the 21 countries surrounding Israel, and certainly not within Gaza. But what Hamas does to its opponents is torture and kill them. So I'm proud of those voices. I'm proud of that Ibrahimic heritage. And may that heritage of Abraham, which is also the heritage of Ibrahim, may that Ibrahim voice become the dominant voice of Islam, which actually stands against the position of its governments, against the positions of its leadership, and actually stands as a powerful and moral force. Does everyone understand that? We can't begin without saying that. Okay. But that's not the end of the story, my friends. We have to be able, right, to follow a story through. Okay? We got to be able to follow a story through and understand what's happening, right? We got to take it step at a time. Okay? So I'm going to give you 2 thought experiments. Tragic thought experiments, but absolutely true. And I've articulated versions of these for 15, 20 years, 30 years. Other people have articulated parallel versions of them, and they're just simply and tragically true. They were even implicitly affirmed today in the op-ed of the New York Times, which is a paper that has in many ways lost its way. I think Barry Weiss was not wrong to leave the New York Times and create an independent sources of information. But today, the New Yorker, they didn't get it all right, but everything I'm about to say is implicit and clear in the actual op-ed of the New York Times, although they don't frame it this way, obviously. So stay close. Moral equivalence, there's no place for moral equivalence. And moral equivalence means, and I'm going to take this slow, moral equivalence means, one, that you make an equivalence between the position of Hamas and the position of Israel today. That's one kind of moral equivalence, one. But 2, you suggest that which is driving Hamas is the quote-unquote brutality of the occupation. That is not true. Those are both forms of moral equivalence. That is not true. It is not the force driving Hamas at its core. So let's begin. 2 thought experiments. Are you ready? Thought experiment 1. What would happen if Israel made a unilateral announcement? You're right, everybody? Israel makes a unilateral announcement. We are laying down our arms. We're laying down our arms. We will not pick up our arms. And this is a thought experiment. This is not a realpolitik reality. This is a thought experiment. It's how you kind of understand and make distinctions. We're going to lay down our arms. We're done. Hamas, do what you will. And Hamas is persuaded that Israel is laying down its arms. What would happen? An utter massacre of the most epic massacres in human history with fierce and horrific brutality. That's what happened. Be a bloodbath. A bloodbath of Jewish blood. That's what would happen. That's clear. What would happen? Now, friends, stay close. What would happen, again, in this thought experiment, if Hamas laid down its arms and said, just like the first part of the thought experiment, we're actually making peace. We want peace. We're going to lay down our arms. What would happen? There would not be a bloodbath, my friends. There would be peace. That's a fundamental distinction. Okay, let me say it a little differently. That's one version of a thought experiment. Right? And in a certain sense, there's a simplicity to the incredible, painful complexity of the Middle East. There's also a simplicity. One side wants the other side dead. That's actually true. That's true. Now, again, I'm going to talk about the history of this conflict. I know the history of this conflict very well. I've read the Palestinian books on it, the ones that are clear, the ones that are distortion. I've read the Israeli books. I've lived it. I know dozens of people on both sides. And I'd be the first person to fiercely critique, right, any degradations in any Israeli position, and I have. And I'll continue to. But there is not a moral equivalence between these two positions. It's just not true. I'll give you just a second example. The second version of this thought experiment. Imagine if Israel used its own women and children. Now, Becca, wait. It's not simple that it's their land we're taking. Becca, you got to read deeper. It's a much much deeper issue in terms of the facts. So go slow, think deeper, go slow. Just take it one point at a time. That's what it means to be Homo Amor, point at a time. Next step. Let's get this clear. So let's say that Israel decided to use its own people as human shields. Its own women and children as human shields. So the first thing is, anyone listening for real knows that couldn't be possible. Because you actually understand that there's a different structure stage of consciousness that's running the center of gravity, right, of the collective called Israel. Israel's not going to use its women and children as shields. Right, so first you've got to get that. But number two, let's say Israel did. Right? So of course it wouldn't work because Hamas would kill them. Hamas wouldn't care. But Hamas knows that when they use their women and children as shields, Hezbollah famously will create a crowd of children around an American soldier of their children and then blow up the crowd of children to kill several American soldiers. Fact! They literally place their missiles, machine guns, bazookas on literally the backs of children because they know that the center of moral gravity of the Israeli soldier is they're going to hesitate and not shoot. So let's just understand this. There's two groups in the world. There are those people who use their children as human shields, and those people who think that using children as human shields today, in this moment in time, that consciousness has evolved. Yes, people historically did that, and we completely repudiate that. And we stand against it with every fiber of our being, right? You can't make that moral distinction. You cannot engage in this conversation, and you cannot be Homo Amor. Homo Amor has the capacity to make those two distinctions. If you cannot make those two distinctions, you can't actually engage as Homo Amor. Period. And so those are very elementary distinctions. This is not talking about what policy should be. We're not talking about policy. We're not talking about what Israel should do or not do. We're not talking about any of those things. 3, last moral distinction. And I don't know what Israel should do today. There's multiple possibilities. That's not the discussion I'm having right now. We'll have that discussion, but not right now. But I just want to make the third distinction. You cannot equate a response to vicious, utterly degraded terror. You can't equate the response to it with the act of terror. So, for example, did the Allied troops need to respond to Nazism in World War II? They did. That does not make their actions equivalent to Nazism. Did the Allied troops need to bomb in the best ways they could during World War II? They did. Did the Allied troops need to do their best to avoid civilian casualties? Yes, they did. And the Allies often did not do that, which was a travesty and a horror. Does Israel need possibly to bomb? Possibly. I'm not an Israeli commander. I'm not on the ground. I don't have the arrogance or hubris to be making military decisions from a basement in Portland, Maine. And nor should you from whatever basement you're in. Let's get real. But does Israel need to respond? And is bombing possibly part of the response like it was for the Allied in World War II? Possibly. Does Israel need to do everything it can to avoid civilian casualties? It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And what does Israel do when ambulances are used for Hamas terrorists, when hospitals are used as Hamas command centers, when schools are used as the central place where the Hamas terrorists gather? In other words, we're using the human shield as a population, both individually and the larger population, is the actual tactic of Hamas. And Becca, my dear beloved sister, that's not because you love your land so much. I want you to be clear, right? This is not about loving the land. That's not what this is about. That's not what this is about at all, right? There's when you actually understand, right, the interior psychology of Hamas, this is not nationalism gone bad, right? This is a devastatingly tragic expression of humanity having lost its way, in which you use your own babies and your own children as fodder. Hamas kills its opponents. It kills gay commanders in its own ranks. Hamas is aligned with Iran, who's been killing teenage girls for the last year after Masha Amin was killed. Iran's been killing teenage girls left and right. Over 1,000 probably in the last year. That's Hamas's major trainer. Right? This is not, they're not killing, right, teenage girls, taking them out of schools because of Gaza, but because of a fundamental, right, tragic, degraded understanding, which is not just ethnocentric, but ethnocentric. We're the only real human beings, only our particular narrow slice, our own narrow Shiite or Sunni God understanding. We're the only ones who are actually human. No one else is actually a human being besides us. That's not nationalism. Let's just understand this. That distinction needs to be made. That distinction needs to be made. If we can't make that distinction, we can't even begin to have the conversation, right? Right? We need to be able to make that distinction. But you can't place your attention in 18 places. Okay, let's actually place our attention and work these things through everybody. Let's work these things through together. Okay, I want to read you something. And we need to understand this. So I'm going to read you two things, and these are not simple, my friends. These are not simple. These are not simple. Let's stay close, my friends. Let's stay close. I'm going to read you two things. And they're tragic. But if we can't turn away, if we can't see this, if we don't understand this, right, we can't actually have a conversation. I'm going to actually go through three texts with you. And none of this is to lose the Abraham position, the Ibrahim and Abraham position with which I started. Does everyone understand that? I've made that very, very clear. So don't get lost here. Really follow the thread with me, okay, sweethearts, beloveds? Okay, so here we go. I want to read you something, which is, I first heard this story from Chana Sarna. Okay? From Chana Sarna. Chana Sarna lived in what's Hebron, Hebron. She lived in Hebron. Okay? Her father was the dean of a seminary in Hebron, right? A seminary of Talmudic study, which had close relationships, close friendships, right, with the local Arab community. This is 1929. There's no state. There are competing forces in the area that's now called Israel, that the Romans called Palestine. There's competing forces, but it's 1929. And there's this community in Hebron. Some 50 Jews, men and women, had taken refuge outside. They were huddled in one room. The Arabs were the soldiers of the Grand Mufti Husseini. The Grand Mufti Husseini was a key force, who later allied with Hitler, who was a key force, right, in the Palestinian world. And this was a key force who slaughtered the leadership of the Palestinians, who wanted to create a sharing of the land, who wanted to create coexistence, who wanted to find a ground of shared value. This was called the Nashahibi clan. and the Husseini clan slaughtered, over a period of a decade, their opponents, killed, abused, raped their daughters, and slaughtered them in a brutal slaughter, the Husseinis against the Nashahibis. That's actually what happened. What happened was there were major, significant, real voices within the local Arab population that realized, wow, we have a claim to this land. And the Jews have a deep claim to this land. And it's not a case of an indigenous people versus an invader. There's actually two legitimate claims to this land. We can actually do this together and prosper and create a new vision of how human beings live together. And all of those voices who were madly committed to the best of Islam were slaughtered. And they were slaughtered by, the Husseini clan. So what we're about to do, we need to understand this. So the same Husseini clan, these are now agents of the Husseini clan that essentially go to Hebron and they arouse the most tragic parts of Islam in the local population. It's Saturday, August 24th, 9 in the morning. After blowing open the door, they cut off hands, they cut off fingers, they cut off testicles. They held heads over a stove, they gouged out eyes. They scalped the rabbi, they made off with his brains. On Mrs. Sokolov's lap, one after the other, they sat 6 students from the yeshiva, with her still alive from the seminary, and slit their throats. They mutilated the men, cutting off their sexual organs. They shoved 13-year-old girls, mothers and grandmothers into the blood and raped them in unison. Mrs. X, I won't say her name, is lying in a Jerusalem hospital. They killed her husband at her feet, then slaughtered her child in her arms. But you will remain alive, these 20th century men told her. This is not an account. This is an account, if you want to read this account, Inika, read a book by a British man named Albert Londerez, O-L-N-D-R-E-S, Albert Londerez. He's from 1884 to 1932. He was an eyewitness. The name of the book is The Wandering Jew Has Arrived. That's the name of the book, The Wandering Jew Has Arrived. What I just read you is from page 168. This is 100 years ago. This was 100 years ago. Does everyone understand that? This is not now. This horrific scene takes place 100 years ago. And it's that scene, my friends, that just got reenacted. This scene is not a result of Israel's policy in Gaza. And we'll get to Israel's policy in Gaza. We'll get there. But deep breath, my friends. You need to be able to follow a story. That's what a movie does. How do we follow a story? This exact scene from 1929 was just reenacted, and it's being reenacted time and again. There's not a moral equivalence here. One of the expressions of moral equivalence, and on this I agree with Sam Harris, is when you actually say, what caused that which happened in Israel 9 to 8 days ago now, was actually anger and outrage at the occupation. That is not true. First off, we need to know that storyline. We haven't even gotten to that storyline. We haven't even gotten to what is the occupation? What does that even mean? Those words don't even mean anything. How did we get here? What are the 10 stages that led to this story? We haven't gotten there. Okay? And I'm engaged here not in politics. I'm going to do here a mystical act of telling the truth. And if anyone has to go, please, I love you, mad brother, go. But I can't be a lover unless I can place my attention. So even in the middle of my son's bar mitzvah, I'm going to place my attention here with you. We're going to have to go through this step by step. We're not going to be entertained in little snippets, right? Oh, I got this now. No. We have to place our attention. This is a mystical act. So I want to just take a second, and read for you, an account of what actually happened, And this is an account by Maor Shammai. Okay? Oh my God. 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 And we have to scream truth. And we have to whisper truth. And we got to talk it softly, and we got to talk it fiercely. We've got to talk it tenderly, and we got to talk it with agony. It's all the same. Okay? And this is an account, and just stay with the narrative. I just want to hear him. Right? Ma'or Shammai. And he writes, and Talia forwarded this to me. So Ma'or writes, I want to share a message. It's not easy to hear. Please don't play this message where children can hear. He says, I want to tell you, and this, we're talking about a festival, which is a trance festival, where people are having these very, very deep medicine experiences, right? These very, very deep medicine journeys. And it's not left wing and right wing, and there's Jews and non-Jews there. And they're there to actually go to that deep place where human beings are one. And there's no political divisions. And they're in their purity, and they're in their eros, and they're in their sacredness. And these are people, there's 5,000 people there, and they're on journeys. So Ma'or talks about the eyewitness accounts that came to him from his close friends. When the terrorists came in, they took young women, partners of our friends. They tied our friends up and raped their women in front of them. They cut off the men's sexual organs while the men were still alive, and then killed the women. Or they raped women on top of dead bodies of other women. Right? You understand what we're talking about? Does everyone understand what we're talking about here? Right? We're talking about a level of brutality, right? We're talking about a level of horror, and this is just one piece of a story, right? We're talking about horror. But this happened in 1929. You can always have, in any group, you can have an occasional aberrant horror, a person or a group of people who go berserk, like the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War. When a My Lai massacre happened in the Vietnam War, stay close. Those men were held accountable. They went to prison. They were viewed as violations of everything that the United States stood for. So I want you to get the distinction. Now, the United States has its own sins to atone for, and Israel has its sins to atone for. Of course they do. But that's not, of course they do, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying there's no moral equivalence. Right? When an Israeli soldier violates the code of ethics, and I want you to get this, have Israeli soldiers done wrong things? Of course they have. And when an Israeli soldier does something wrong, which violates the code of ethics of the Israeli army, read the code of ethics of the Israeli army, right? Read the code of ethics of the Israeli army. And line after line, which talks about how do we teach our soldiers to be moral when their lives are at stake in every millisecond. And how do we actually, right, talk about the soldiers' moral obligation to protect innocent civilians? And how do we forbid categorically any targeting of civilians or any using of civilians, right, to clear an area? Right? You actually read the Israeli Army Code of Ethics. It's one of the most sacred documents written by humanity ever. Now, Israel has done everything in its power to honor that code of ethics. And when it seems like soldiers have acted out of alignment with it, even when there wasn't clear evidence on either side, soldiers have been severely, intensely punished. But that's the precise opposite when we're talking about the basic ethos of Hamas and Gaza, right? And the worldwide community, editors on Teen Vogue, editors in the Washington Post, right? Who basically say this is what decolonization looks like. We have voices all over the world, in Sydney and in London, right? Exploding in joy. We have all over the West Bank and all over Gaza, spontaneous, right? Explosions of joy When I was driving through the West Bank and there was an attempt to stop my car and kill my children in the back seat, that's been a standard policy to isolate an Israeli car on the road. Parents and children, kill the parents. And then those people become heroes, right? Do you understand? And the question is, what is read the founding documents of Hamas. Read the founding documents of Fatah, the PLO. Read the founding documents of the Israeli army. You're going to find a completely different world. A completely different world. A completely different structure of consciousness. That was implicit. Actually, in the New York Times editorial this morning. That's a big deal, right? And so we need, but, right, Inika, before we move forward to what to do, we need to make this distinction. You're thinking, Inika, that this distinction is clear. It's not clear. This is not clear. This distinction has been denied all over the world. Krista, let's take a look at London for a second. Just show us that clip, Krista, at London, just for a second, right, of the response in central London. But I could show you 50 scenes like this. The response in Manhattan, in Sydney, Australia. Okay? Right? So first we have to just take it step at a time, Marilyn. Go slow. Let's just go step at a time. Be willing to go slow. Make love slowly. Make love slowly, step at a time. Wow, so just get a sense of that, right? My beloved Inika, this is where it is, right? This is not one scene in the world. This is, you look at a comment by the editor of Teen Vogue magazine in America, right? A women's magazine, right? And I could cite you now 50 comments from the president of Harvard, his first comments, from student groups in Harvard, from a professor at Yale, right? From the leading universities in the world. My friends, hold this with me. The leading universities in the world said in dozens and dozens of statements, knowing full well what happened, they said, this is what decolonization looks like. Do you hear that, my friend Becca? No, that's not okay. That's not okay. That's not right. We need to, don't jump to what to like, just understand. Understand this in your body. If Israel would use its men and women as human shields, which is utterly absurd, we know Israel wouldn't do it, they'd just be mowed down by Hamas. Hamas uses its population as human shields, knowing the moral distinction. And yet the editor of Teen Vogue can't work out that moral distinction, right? And the crowd in Manhattan, after knowing the savagery and the butchery, right, dances and rejoices. So let's go slow here. And the massacre in Hebron, my friends, the massacre in Hebron that I talked about That wasn't in response to the Israeli occupation in Gaza. That was the fundamental force in Islam that has taken Islam over, which was represented by Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who slaughtered the other Arab voices. Friends, I lived right in the West Bank of Israel. I lived in a house with a beautiful Arab family in Jaffa. I spoke out in Israel not once and not twice for the utter need to have the greatest possible humanity we can have at checkpoints. Right, when I went back to Israel the last time, before I left Israel and came to work in the States, right, I did an interview with Yossi Sarid, and we had become good friends, and he was a leading left politician, right, whose positions were very, very, very opposed. Israel should always be, just like the United States should be, held accountable to the highest standard of possibility. And we can't make a moral equivalence. If we make a moral equivalence, we actually misunderstand something. Just stay with me, guys, okay? Stay with me, okay? Just stay. Just see it. This is what I'm saying. It's so hard for us to place our attention. Follow the thread, okay? Let's take a look now. Let's look at a thread from Gaza. Speaking to Gazan children, this is a tragic thread. There's no jingoism. There's no kind of joy in showing you this thread. This thread breaks my heart. Right? Nicholas Kristof points to this. He basically says the same thing as his thread in his column 2 days ago. And Nicholas Kristof is a complete opponent of the Israeli government. Kristof makes the same point. Show us the thread. It's a tragic thread.
ترفع الراس لفلسطين. العمليات هاي تاعت الدعس والسكاكين هاي إشي بيرفع الراس لفلسطين.
أقرأ اليهود
بعلمونا إن الصهيونية هم أعدائنا وهم أهم إشي لازم يسوي فيهم عملية.
يعني إنهم بيعلمونا بالمدرسة إنهم إرهابيين
بيحكوا لنا عن اليهود إنهم هدول مش منيح وهدول بقتلوا قاعدين بشبابنا. بيحكوا لنا هدول غدارين. وبيحكوا لنا إنه هدول بغدرونا هدول مش منيح. إذا بطعن بدعس عليهم. عمل عمليات.
كيف يعني؟
الدعس. عمليات الدعس، عمليات الطعن والاشتباك المسلح في المخيمات.
Okay, that's tragic. Right? 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 These kids were born innocent. These kids were born innocent. Do you understand that? These kids were born innocent. It's horrific. Right? I want to read you a piece by Nicholas Kristof, and I'm specifically reading pieces that are fundamentally from the liberal and left world, so you understand. So I want to read you a piece for a second by Nicholas Kristof. So Kristof writes, on a reporting trip to Gaza, this is Kristof, 2 decades ago, I interrupted some high school boys playing soccer. And the boys look innocent and sweet. And they are, in some part of their soul, innocent and sweet. That's the tragedy. Do you understand, Becca? That's the tragedy, right? So I interrupted some high school boys playing soccer and asked them about their lives and hopes. The conversation veered to Israel and terrorism, so I quizzed them about whether they believed it would be morally acceptable for a Palestinian to bomb a group of Israeli women. That's okay, said Motaz Abu Layla, then 15 as I wrote at the time. They all fight in their army. I pushed harder. Would it be reasonable to set off a bomb in an Israeli high school for girls? More nods. Fine, said Ibrahim Abu Daya, then 18. God knows the girls will become fighters. What about blowing up the American embassy? Excellent. I asked, what about blowing up an Israeli nursery school? No. They said no. They had found their limit and prided themselves in their compassion. Right? In recent days, Kristof writes, I've thought about the people I've met in Gaza. I wondered if some of those boys, sweet and friendly to me, were among the terrorists participating in the savagery in Israel last weekend. Right? Right? Oh my God. Oh my God. So just hold this with me. Don't jump. If you can, and again, I'm being a little fierce today. And I apologize with full insincerity, right? Because this is fierce and it's tender and it's heartbreaking beyond imagination. Nicholas Kristof, Becca, is not in any sense a kind of right-wing Israeli sympathizer, quite the opposite. If you look at who he is, okay? Right? This is not just one piece of evidence, my love. There's tens of thousands. Are there exceptional voices of fury in Israel that could sound similar, extremely exceptional, that are then completely castigated, right, by the mainstream of Israeli society? The question is not the exceptional voices. The question is, who is your hero? The hero, I want you to get the difference. The hero is the butcher of innocent women and children. That's the hero, right, in the world of Hamas. Right? The hero, right, in Israel is not that. That's an anti-hero. Right? Even at Israel's worst times, which have been horrible, it's still an anti-hero. Right? That the notion that Israel could or should do anything like going into and targeting civilians and then cutting off, right, the phalluses of men as they rape the women on the dead bodies of their friends. No, those are not heroes. That is considered to be sick and a violation of the fundamental Homo Imago Dei. Until we're willing to make that moral distinction between actions, it's not a racial distinction. Be clear. It's not a racial distinction at all. Everyone get that? This is not, I want to make sure in the chat, everyone get that this is not a racial distinction at all. But it is a distinction in the consciousness of two different societies. Does everyone get that distinction? Right? Who are your heroes? What is your ethos? What do your founding documents say? This is essential. Who's your hero? Right, my beloved? And Becca, I love you for standing. Right? You're standing as I am. Becca and I together, we're standing together with the voice of Abraham. And the voice of Abraham is, everything Mark's saying is true. And we can't kill 50 innocent people. Okay, that's a legitimate Abraham voice. I don't know what Israel should do right now. Right? I'm speaking and leading and teaching and sharing and crying from the certainty and the uncertainty together. But what I do know is, and I'm asking again to hold the story in the center here. Right? Who's my hero? Okay? Let me try and go 2 steps deeper. I'm going to go just 2 more steps today. 2, maybe 3. Okay? So just stay close because we need some of this to be able to understand where we are. So first, I want to say something about just a couple of more points, 3, 4 more points. So first, about levels of consciousness. It's hard to get. Okay? Hard to get. Hard to get. Right? Hard to get. Right? Hard to get. Right? It's hard to get. So let's try and understand. Right? And I'm not suggesting what Israel should do or not do. What I am suggesting is that Israel is trying, right, is trying to discriminate. Now, what should Israel do? Right? Hard. I'm not going to go there now. We will get there. But first, I need just to understand where we are. Let's look at 4 levels of consciousness. Level 1. Level 1. Let me just say something before. I just want to say something before. We can never lose the voice of Abraham, right? And would the voice of Abraham cut off food and water? No. No, of course the voice of Abraham wouldn't cut off food and water, right? And there's this argument in the book of Genesis, and Sodom and Gomorrah, that kind of archetype, is destroyed in the end, and Lot is saved. When Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister, with his heart broken says, they've become animals and we're going to treat them like animals, he has to make a distinction. He has to say that we're going to do everything that we can. We're going to do everything that we can within every possibility of our power to protect innocent lives. And Hamas needs to be held accountable for placing their command centers in the very center of innocent lives. Now, what should Israel do in that situation? I don't know yet. And I want to just be willing to stay with me in the uncertainty. Be willing to stay with me in the uncertainty. Okay, be willing to stay with me in the uncertainty. Hold the uncertainty before you jump. Hold the uncertainty before you jump. Stay in it. Let's follow the story. This is hard. This is hard. It's impossible. So let's stay in the impossibility together. Okay, so here's the next step. So there's 4 levels of consciousness that we can talk about in just one model. There's egocentric, right, where my care and love is for me and my survival clan. That's one level. Second level is ethnocentric, where my circle of intimacy, my survival clan, okay, right, my survival clan is me and, the second circle of intimacy is me and my tribe, whoever my tribe is, right, and only my tribe is chosen, only my tribe is human, and anyone outside of my tribe, right, essentially is not human. That's the actual experience. That's the Hamas version of a tragic ethnocentric. Not all ethnocentric is tragic. You can be an American patriot. You can be a Belgian patriot. You can be an Israeli patriot. You can be, right, an Arab patriot, an Egyptian patriot, right, a West Bank patriot, right? You can be a patriot and not be that kind of degraded ethnocentric horror. So Hamas, right, is a degraded ethnocentric horror. Right? It's the degraded version of the ethnocentric moment. Then you have world-centric. World-centric is, in my circle of intimacy is every human being. We are the world. Right? 1985, Freddie Mercury, Live Aid concert. Right? We are the world. But even when you're at world-centric, stay close, you're not yet cosmocentric. What does cosmocentric mean? I have a sense of felt care and love and intimacy and concern, not only with human beings, but in a different way. It's not the same, but in a different way with animals. So I don't eat lamb chops from factory farms. Does everyone get that? Stay close. I don't eat lamb chops from factory farms because I'm cosmocentric, right? But when I'm world-centric, I can't even imagine that I would care about those animals. I'm going to have as many steaks as I want. I don't care if those animals were tortured on factory farms. I'm going to eat it anyways. Right? Because I'm world-centric. I can't see beyond my circle of intimacy. Okay? So let's try and go slow here and feel this. Okay? So the ethnocentric, brutal moment, which says only my people are human, actually sees and feels that beyond my circle of intimacy, the people aren't human. They're animals. All of them, not just the ones that behaved like animals. Right? The most demonic expressions of Nazism, human beings did become beasts. So human beings can become animals. But when I call a group of human beings animals, meaning those who are outside of my circle of intimacy, then I'm engaged in the horrific crime of ethnocentric racism, which itself is a tragic violation of what it means to be a human being. And 1,000 years ago, that's where all of humanity was. Does everyone get that sentence? And 1,000 years ago, almost all of humanity was there, with some rare exceptions, right? Actually, one of the exceptions was the early text in Genesis, which said that every human being is created in the image of God. That was a rare, exceptional text. But the center of gravity of most of human culture was, outside of my people, they're not even human. That's tragic. But you've got to get that. You've got to get that the experience, this is not about, right, loving or not loving my land. It's not what this is about. I want you to get that. I want you to kind of, right, we have to actually have this feeling and knowing what is the ethnocentric tragedy which says only my people are human. You know, the ethnocentric person says, in the tragic form, that you can't commit murder. And Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, pointed this out. You can't commit murder. But murder means only killing some of my people. No one else's murder. Okay? So let's feel this. Let's feel this, every human being. Let's just start there before it even gets to the animal world, which in the end does need to be included. For sure. But let's just start every human being. There's no one outside the circle. And we're going to have conflicts. Right, my beloveds? We're going to have conflicts. And if you actually look at the history of the founding of the State of Israel in the last 100 years, right? And here I'm going to go the next step. And this is the next step. And I'm going to go this, and I want to kind of just be in the story with you for a second. Okay? I want to be in the story with you for a second. And I made a couple of notes for myself. And I want to be in the story with you just for a second. Okay? Right? You know, how did this all happen? So let's understand this very, very clearly. Okay? Let's feel each other. Do I think, Becca, that the local population, again, when we talk about Palestine, we don't even know what that is. Right? We don't even know what that is. Okay, but let's try and understand what we really mean. Let's get out of slogans. Let's talk about what we're really talking about here, okay? So now I'm going to kind of go this next step and actually talk, which we haven't done up till now, about what's the storyline. You got to be able to track a story. And there should be a possibility of creating a shared story of value in which the entire population of this tragically disputed territory, right, should be able to actually agree on. Okay? And if we can't feel, if we're not willing to actually place attention on the story, then again, we're not Homo Amor. Homo Amor places attention. And the Hebrew word for placing attention is sim lev. Let me place my attention. So let's place our attention. Okay? So, and I'm going to tell you in the beginning, I'm going to already tell you my conclusion. Okay? I think there are two legitimate competing claims on the same land. Are we clear about that? Becca, did you hear that, my sister, my love? There are two legitimate competing claims on the same land. That's big. That's a big thing to say. I want to say it again. There are two legitimate competing claims on the same land. Does everyone hear that? Who hears that? Okay, that's big. Hold that with me. Hold that with me. Hold that with me. Okay, so now what do I do when that's the case? That's the question. But first, let me just tell you a little bit of the story. The Ottoman Empire controlled, right, what is now the space where there are essentially 22 Arab states covering vast amounts of territory with, I don't know the exact amount, but 100+ million, right? Huge amount of people. Then there's this tiny sliver that's today called Israel, which has 9 million people. Okay? How did we get here? What happened? So essentially, let me just walk you through, just very, very, very simply, what actually happened in this story, so we can actually just get a sense of just kind of like, how did we get here? Like, what actually happened here? So what happened is, Britain is awarded what's called the British Mandate. So Britain is told, right, when the Ottoman Empire collapses, Britain takes over the primary mandate for all of the territory in the Middle East. Okay? Now, all of the countries, Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and in Libya and in Israel, right? All right, everything that was established in this area was not established because they operated independently. In other words, it's not like, oh, there used to be a Palestinian state that got conquered. Never happened. There were only 3 independent political commonwealths, right, in this area ever in human history. And those were 3 Jewish commonwealths that lived there over history. That's just factually true. There was never any other independent sovereign government in this place other than 3 Jewish commonwealths. And again, let me say in advance, I'm not going to now give you, this is the Jewish position. I've already said in advance, there are 2 legitimate competing claims on this land. Okay? So now let's just kind of relax, surrender, right? Soften our armor. Let's just kind of hear it for a second. Now, when I'm going to try and do this just and this needs several hours to do well. I'm going to just try and do it in a few minutes. So, when the destruction of the second Jewish Commonwealth happens, some short amount of time after Jesus, the Roman governor of the area calls it Palestina, right? In order to break its connection to the Jewish people, it's called Palestina. And then, for 1800 years, right, there is local indigenous populations, right? This is even before there's an Arab world, right? And there's many, many stages of local populations in this huge mass of land, right, in this Arabian Peninsula, okay? One of the populations that's there, right, is a Jewish population that maintains a steady, small Jewish presence, right, all through the last couple of thousand years. And the Jewish communities that are exiled and massacred all over the world all maintain and look to Israel, right, as their home. These are just facts. Okay. During the time of the Ottoman Empire, this land, this Fertile Crescent, is occupied, right, again, this entire Arabian Peninsula by local populations, right, which we now call Arab populations. This is under the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which falls. Britain then kind of takes over. It's after World War I. Now, what essentially happens is there are within this Arabian Peninsula, right, Britain makes a decision and establishes some, depending how you count, 19, 20, 21, 22, whatever the count is, independent, sovereign Arab states. That's one. In one part of the land, which is the part of the land which is now called Israel-Palestine, there is an infusion of Jewish settlers who come from Europe wanting to return to what their native history, the biblical history, has told them is the Jewish homeland. When they start coming in the late 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920, right, there are very, very deep relationships that are established with the local Arab community. The local Arab community is obviously filled with many, many beautiful people, and there are mutually productive relationships started, which are quite beautiful and quite deep and quite profound. What then happens is, about 1920, Great Britain takes over the mandate, and within the Arab world, there are 2 major strains, major expressions of the Arab voice. One, which is enormously powerful, many historians say a majority. I can't I haven't verified all those facts, but a huge, powerful, major kind of mainstream Arab position, which is expressed by the Nashahibi family. It's the name of kind of one central Arab clan. Emir Faisal earlier on is another expression of it, who has a deep relationship with Chaim Weizmann, who was later to become the first Jewish president, right, of the Israeli state, the first Israeli president of the Israeli state. And there's this enormous possibility that we could actually share this land in some way, whatever that means. There's a second voice, which is incarnate in history most dramatically by the Mufti Husseini, right, whose agents and whose family is at play for several decades, who in the end align with Hitler in World War II, who basically say no, right? They adopt a position similar to that today of Hamas, which says there cannot be any two competing claims in this land, right? This land must be purely not just Arab land. No, it has to be a particular kind of Islamic land for a particular brand of Islam, right? And from a particular militant brand of Islam, which basically says that the rest of the world is subject to the Islamic sword. And if there is any presence in the Arabian Peninsula of anything other than this particular brand of Islam, then it's a violation of the honor of the Prophet, and blood must soak the land. Okay, those are the two basic positions that are taken. Okay? And Husseini won, right? Tragically. Tragically, Husseini carries the day. The Nashahibis are slaughtered. This is a long and detailed history that's been talked about. And let me try and walk through it a little bit here, okay? Let me try and walk through it a little bit. Let me walk through it a little more carefully, okay? So, in 2019, there's a conversation between Emir Faisal, who's a major Arab leader, and Weizmann, and they talk about a possibility of genuine Jewish-Arab coexistence. That's one. Two, 1920-21, huge massacres within, huge murders, use the word murders, taking place in the Arab world, where people aligned with actually creating a shared ground of value, right, with the Jews who are now returning, right, to Israel, and with the indigenous Jewish population, right? They say that can't be done. That's a violation of the honor of the Prophet. So there's an extreme explosion of murders, 1920-21. 1936, there's what's called the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt, right, is fundamentally Husseini inspired. Again, this is where the massacre of the Nashahibis and of all the other voices for a shared ground of value in the Arab world are decimated. What is set up in response is called the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission is set up by Great Britain, and the Peel Commission recommends a dividing of the territory, with 80% of the territory going to the Arab population, with 20% of the territory going to the Jews, right? And the Husseini-led, inspired, Hamas-like position says absolute no. It's completely rejected. That's actually what happened. We go fast forward 10 years later. 10 years later, right, there's this development of the situation which deepens. There's more Jewish settlements, right? There's more massacres on the Arab side. There's this incitement to kind of a brand of Arab nationalism, which is not classical nationalism, but which is Husseini-inspired racist nationalism of the worst kind, which says that those outside of my ethnocentric circle aren't actually human in the same way, and the Prophet's honor is violated. And so there's this 10 years of enormous pain. 1947, Great Britain says, we don't know what the fuck to do. They turn to the United Nations. The United Nations, right, says, again, let's partition the land. Let's split the land in two. Okay, again, with most of the land going Arab, less going to the Jews, right? The Jews say, we accept it. We'll accept this partition, right? The Arabs say categorically no. And on the first day, right, when in response to this United Nations offer, right, Ben-Gurion, who's the prime minister, the first prime minister of Israel, declares independence, on that day, 5 Arab armies, which outgun in every way in terms of troops, guns, munitions, right, attack Israel, right, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, right, Syria, right, etc. The world thinks actually the Jews won't survive it, right? They do survive, right? And in that war, a couple of things happen. First, in surviving, that's called the Independence War, in surviving that war, 2 things happen. One, and both happened, I want to get really straight, both happened. One, and the prime minister of Syria writes about this in his memoir, right? The Arab leaders tell the Arab populations of, right, the disputed territories to leave, and then they'll return after the Jews have been wiped out, after the Jews have been massacred. Literally, those are the languages used. Hitler's job will be completed, then you'll return to your liberated lands. So what happens is there's an entire group of Arabs who leave for that reason, several 100,000. Then there's another group that are actually evicted, right in the war with intention by the Israeli side, because they feel like we're not going to be able to actually hold, right, a secure, right, new Israel. And so there's an actual forced transfer of population. That's actually true, right? There's this big argument. Do the Arabs who left in that moment leave voluntarily, or were they forced? Both are true. Actually, they're both true. So about 800,000 total, right, of local Arabs left their land. That's true. At the same time, there were about 800,000 of Jews who had been in Arab lands, for 1,000, 2,000 years, who were also forced out of their lands. So there was this actual population transfer on both sides. The Arab populations that left their lands became refugees. Now, I want you to get this. In 1949, right, after the war, the United Nations established UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Association, was established 70 years ago, right, to handle those 800,000 refugees, which the Arab leadership intentionally refused to integrate in any of the 22 larger Arab states in order to keep them as refugees as a linchpin for the eventual destruction and annihilation of Israel. That was a policy. I'm not even saying whether it was right or wrong. I'm just saying that was a policy. That's a fact. And in fact, the UNRWA still exists today. It's 70 years later, and it has a budget of $1 billion a year. It has a $1 billion a year budget until today. That's just true. That's true. The 800,000 refugees of Jews from Arab lands, who were also, some of them left voluntarily and others were forced out, were all absorbed in Israel and became part of the fabric and structure of Israel. Now, I'm not even saying now what's right, what's wrong. I'm just giving you, these are the objective facts of the situation. Now, did Israel behave brutally during the Independence War? So the answer to that question is almost unilaterally no. And you can read very, very carefully accounts of actually what happened. There was an enormous attempt to behave as morally as any army can. There's a famous account of one massacre that's called the Deir Yassin massacre. What actually happened there is hotly contested. Shmuel Katz, right, an intensely moral man that I met at the end of his life, wrote an account of what actually happened there in his book called Battleground, called Fact and Fantasy in Palestine. Right, there are opposing accounts that are circulated, right, by the Palestinian leadership, right, and that's a hotly contested account. I happen to believe Shmuel Katz's account, but I wasn't there. But that was an exception. Whatever happened there was a dramatic exception that was condemned, right, by the entire Jewish world. Right? The claim that there were somehow dozens of massacres is not true. Was there a part of the population during Israel's independence war that was forcibly transferred? Yes, there was. Was there a part of the Jewish population that was forcibly transferred from Arab lands? Yes, there was. And virtually every nation state in the world is built on, right, the transfer of indigenous populations, which is tragic. That's absolutely true. I want to be really clear about that. But what's also true is that there's very clear competing claims here. There's a very, very legitimate Arab claim. And there's a very, very legitimate Jewish claim, right? Which is why, if we have a shared ground of value and we recognize we're all human beings, and we don't want to actually kill and destroy each other, and we recognize that we're all created Homo Amor, then we should be able to, right? We should be able to together create a new possibility. And that new possibility should be some version of what's called today a two-state solution. That's legitimate. That's honest. That's holy. Does everyone get that? And the overwhelming majority, right, of Israel, not everyone, but has always held that as a real possibility. And I've lived through myself 5 or 6 successive Israeli governments, right? And they've never been able to create a two-state solution because it was impossible to actually create, right, tragically, I just want to get the tragedy of it, right, on the Arab side of the street, buy-in for the two-state solution. There was an utter refusal, right, to accept that possibility. So I want to just kind of get this, right? And again, this is not to say the Jews got it all right. This is not to say we shouldn't critique Israel, and not to say any of those things, right? But it is to say that if you actually understand and track what actually happened here, there was a suggestion in 1936 by the Peel Commission for a two-state solution, right, which was utterly rejected, right, by the local Arab population, infused with a Husseini-like diabolic hatred. And then in 1947, again, there was a two-state solution offered. And again, the Husseini-infused Hamas-like leadership, with the tragic leadership, right, rejected it out of hand. Now, until this point, I want to see if we get this. I want to see if we kind of get this, right? Now, it's hard, right? It's hard to actually, right, trace this through. But here's where it gets really important to place your attention, friends. Next 5 minutes. Here we go. Stay really close. 1967. Until this point, there is no Gaza or West Bank. The West Bank is part of Jordan. Does everyone get that? West Bank's part of Jordan, literally. One of the new states established by Great Britain's mandate. Gaza is part of Egypt. And Nasser, who's the leader of Egypt, says he picks up that Husseini energy and mantle and says, we're going to complete Hitler's job and we're going to, right, wipe out the Jewish people. Israel launches for its survival a preemptive strike. In that preemptive strike, which is called the Six-Day War, and Israel begs Jordan not to get involved in the war, but Egypt attacks and Syria attacks and Jordan attacks. So in that war, Israel takes the West Bank. And it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's what it is. It's the West Bank of the Jordan River. Israel also takes the Gaza Strip. The West Bank is taken from Jordan in the preemptive strike war of survival by Israel, and the Gaza Strip is taken from Egypt. Now, that's Six-Day War is over. What should happen now? So there's a great debate in Israel about what should happen. There's an overwhelmingly strong position that says, let's trade land for peace. And what land we're talking about now? So we're talking about the West Bank, right? Gaza. Both of those could be a ground for a Palestinian state. But the Arab League gathers a few months later in Khartoum and issues its famous 3 no's. No recognition, right? No negotiation, right? No coexistence, no peace. That's what they say. No recognition, no negotiation, no peace. Meaning, this is the third rejection of the possibility of a Palestinian state, unless there's no Israel. So the solution to the conflict has to be Israel's gone. Okay? That's three. Right? That's in 1967. Those are the famous three no's of Khartoum. And then in 2007, Ehud Barak, 2000, the year 2000. In the year 2000, Ehud Barak meets Arafat with Clinton. Okay, with Clinton at Camp David. Right? And Barak, who's the prime minister of Israel, offers Arafat a Palestinian state again, with 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital, with Gaza. And as Clinton said, we were there for 14 days, and Arafat just said no. So there was an utter rejection. That's the fourth rejection. And finally, number 5, in 2008, Ehud Olmert, who I went jogging with in Jerusalem, who was the prime minister of Israel, goes even farther than Barak, adds land to the deal, meets with Abbas, right, who is Arafat's successor, and Abbas cannot muster support for this. He says no. He turns it down again. So I just want you to get this. So 5 times there's been the possibility of a two-state solution, right? And 5 times, does everyone get this? 5 times there's been an utter dramatic no. And I'm praying that the people who were here in the beginning kind of had enough attention and heart to stay in. Stay in here. Actually follow the story. Now, in the middle of this, stay close. Stay close. In the middle of this, Israel, in other words, between 2006, 2008, right, Israel actually unilaterally, and it's before Olmert in 2008, offers the 5th possible land for peace deal. Israel unilaterally withdraws from Gaza. Does everyone get that? Israel unilaterally withdraws from Gaza. Everyone get this? Israel unilaterally withdraws. Egypt doesn't want to take Gaza back. Egypt says no. Hamas comes to rule Gaza. Hamas could have turned Gaza into a flowering state. There was more aid offered to Gaza from around the world for education, for infrastructure, right? For building, for creativity, right? There were 1,000 programs, right, to create bridges of peace of every kind. And Hamas made a decision, right, in the tradition of the Husseini tradition, which is, in the name of the Prophet Allah, Palestine must be soaked with the blood of every Jew. No distinction between Israeli and Jew, of every Jew, because their very existence here is an affront. Let's understand this. So my beloved Sharmila, I am completely in favor of a two-state solution. I would fucking give up Jerusalem itself to make peace. If I thought we could have an Israeli state without Jerusalem as its capital, I'd give it up for the sake of peace. That's not the situation. Okay, can you hear that, my friends? That's not the situation. Does that mean Israel's gotten it right all the time? Of course Israel hasn't gotten it right all the time. But can I state as an absolute fact, right, that the overwhelming majority of the Israeli population would make peace? I absolutely can. Is there a sector of the Israeli population, stay close with me, right? Place our attention, be a lover. Place your attention. Is there a sector of the Israeli population that says we have to keep every inch of Judea and Samaria no matter what? Yes, there is a sector like that. I believe that sector is wrong. And even within that sector within which I lived, even within that sector within which I lived, right? If there was a possibility for peace, Israel would have gone for it. Now, I want you to get this really, really straight, okay? I want you to stay really, really close to me, friends. This is a story that's not told. This is a story that's not told. We talk about the West Bank, and I don't know where my beloved Beck is, but I hope you're here, beloved. Okay, this is for you, my love. Okay, because you represent beautifully this voice of Abraham, gorgeously. But stay close, okay? Stay close. It's a story that's not told. So we talk about the West Bank. So there's the sense, oh, the West Bank, there was a Palestinian nation that was conquered in the West Bank. No, no, no. The West Bank was part of Jordan. It was taken by Israel in a preemptive war for its survival in 1967. Jordan didn't want to take the West Bank back. Right? Let's just understand this. If you remove the West Bank from Israel in its current structure, go really slow with me, okay? Can everyone go slow? Let's say you get rid of the West Bank. So if there's no West Bank, like if you turn the West Bank into an independent state today, there's no West Bank. That means that Israel, which is this tiny country in the middle of the Middle East, that Israel at its very center, the center of Israel, if you see Israel on a map, the center of Israel will be 9 miles wide. Does everyone get that? How many people get that? If you give the West Bank, you can't give it back to Jordan, they don't want it. So if you allow the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank, which I've been in favor of, right? But what's the problem? So 2 problems. And I want you to get both problems really clearly. One, that means that Israel's waste, at the center of the country, the most populated parts of Israel, is literally 9 miles wide. How long does it take to drive 9 miles, my friends? How long does it take? 20 minutes? Meaning you can cut the country in half in a surprise attack like that which happened 8 days ago in a period of a half hour. Stay close. If you cut the country in half, Israel can't mobilize to defend itself because Israel has a very small standing army. It can't afford to keep a large standing army. So its army is of shopkeepers and shoemakers and doctors and kindergarten teachers. You have to mobilize that army like Israel just did. Mobilizing that army takes several days, but if you cut the country in half, you can't mobilize the army. So that's the security reason for keeping the West Bank. That's one, but here's 2. If there was any ground to believe that Israel could actually create, that Israel could actually support the creation on the West Bank of an independent Palestinian state which would be a democracy and live next to Israel and support universal human rights and the rights of the feminine, right? And the rights of girls and the rights of the basic notion of the integrity and decency of every human being, Israel would say, fuck it. Create an independent Palestinian state. We're going to trust that state and we'll live together in peace. But there's zero indication that that can happen. In fact, in all likelihood, if a state was established on the West Bank, it would become a terror state like Gaza. So what's Israel supposed to do, my friends? Okay? Does everyone understand why I didn't begin? Does everyone understand why I didn't begin by, okay, what should Israel do? Right? Does everyone understand how absurd that conversation would be? Slow. Like, wow, slow. Let's place our attention. Let's love each other. Let's unfold this story step at a time. So now you tell me, my friends, what is Israel supposed to do? Does everyone get the horror and the impossibility? Right? Oh my God. Right? The horror and the impossibility. So there's not a moral equivalence. Okay, this is the very last point. With this, we finished. I know that we're way, way, way over time. But I want to finish just with this last point, and I know that there's so much that we needed to do and that we didn't do. Right? But I want to just say something about the feminine, about women. How you treat women goes the world. Now, that doesn't mean that women are always right. Women can make false complaints. Women can be brutal. It's not that the feminine is good and the masculine is bad. That's not what I mean. But how we treat, when I say women, I mean innocent women and children. how we treat innocent, I'm using women and children in the classical way of innocence. How you treat innocent women and children is how the world goes. Okay? Iran and Hamas are the people who are brutalizing the feminine, brutalizing women worse than any other force in the world today. And they're joined by Al-Qaeda, they're joined by Hezbollah, they're joined by, right, the current rulers of Afghanistan, who are all expressions of the same Khomeini strain, the same very narrow strain that's basically been infused by some of the mainstream tenets of Islam, but didn't go the Rumi way, didn't go the Hafiz way, but went the debased and horrific way. And their view of the feminine is horrific. They all endorse what's called honor killing. If a woman is suspected of somehow expressing herself sexually outside, proof doesn't need to be brought. She can be brutally killed by her family. And the family is generally let off the hook because it's an understandable honor killing. Let's just understand what we're talking about here. Let's understand what we're talking about here. So that's what we're going to support? We're going to create a moral equivalence between Israel or the United States, which are flawed. But we're going to create a moral equivalence between those two? Really? So yes, nation states might not be our future. It's a big conversation. Yes, there may be those profiting from war. That may well be true, which is tragic. And the global capitalist structure is tragic, that profits from war. Yes, that's also true. That needs to be taken into account in a very real way. And yes, there undoubtedly have been tragic mistakes by Israel, without question. But who is your hero? Right? What is the story from which you're generating reality? Right? Those distinctions are essential. What's your narrative of desire? Right? How do you go into a trance festival where people are at their most pure, they're most open, there's no left, there's no right, there's no Jew, there's no non-Jew, there's just human beings dancing as she, and violate and mutilate in the most horrific way possible. And then literally, right, kill a child in front of parents and a parent in front of a child. Kill a grandmother and upload her murder to her own Facebook site. And all of that, as the children in Gaza said, is an expression of some version of a twisted and insane form of tragic human ideology. So you ask me, what should Israel do now? I don't know. I do think that Israel, as I think Marilyn said earlier, I think Israel cannot cut off food and water. So Marilyn, thank you for saying that. I think you're right. I think you're right, Marilyn. I don't know if you're here anymore, but I think you're right. Right? Israel cannot cut off food and water. And if Marilyn's not here, please let her know. Right? And Israel correctly opened the water in Gaza South. Right? That was the right thing to do. And Israel's been desperately looking for, right? Israel's been desperately looking for routes of escape. And Egypt has shut the door, and Jordan has shut the door. So I want to understand the tragic impossibility of this. But we can only begin this conversation if we're willing to stay in. I cannot be Homo Amor unless I place my attention. And I want to invite everyone to read. Read. So if you want to read, I'm going to give you a mainstream centrist position. Right? Read a book by Daniel Gordis, Gordis. right, who's a colleague of mine. I haven't spoken to him in 20 years. We don't know each other well. But he wrote a book in kind of the history of Israel. And it's a balanced book that critiques the Israeli government, Gordis, right? Critiques, right, the Israeli government on multiple accounts. But it's worth reading. As goes Israel, goes Europe. As goes Israel, goes the United States. As goes Israel, goes Africa. There is no local. There's only one people and one breath and one humanity. No one's outside the circle. Right? And it's all a holy and a broken hallelujah.